Decoding learning theories. Classical versus operant conditioning in psychology. Introduction. In the realm of psychology, two fundamental theories of learning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, form the cornerstone for understanding how behaviors are acquired and modified. These theories, developed by Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner, respectively, offer distinct perspectives on the mechanisms underlying learning. This exploration aims to unravel the key differences between classical and operant conditioning and highlight their unique contributions to the field of psychology. 1. Foundational concepts. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, involves the association of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus to elicit a conditioned response. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, attributed to B.F. Skinner, focuses on the relationship between behavior and its consequences. It explores how voluntary behaviors are strengthened or weakened based on the consequences that follow them. 2. Associative learning. Classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, learning occurs through the association between stimuli. A neutral stimulus becomes associated with a stimulus that naturally triggers a response, leading the neutral stimulus to elicit a similar response over time. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning emphasizes the association between behaviors and their consequences. Behaviors are strengthened or weakened based on the outcomes they produce. 3. Type of response. Classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, the focus is on involuntary, reflexive responses. The conditioned response is a learned response to a previously neutral stimulus. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning deals with voluntary, purposeful behaviors. The consequences of these behaviors shape the likelihood of their recurrence. 4. Role of stimuli. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning involves a process where a neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that triggers a conditioned response. The stimuli precede the response. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning focuses on the consequences that follow a behavior. Positive or negative reinforcement and punishment influence the likelihood of the behavior occurring again. 5. Learning mechanism. Classical conditioning. The process in classical conditioning involves the automatic association between stimuli. The learner forms connections between stimuli that predict the occurrence of a specific event or response. Operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, learning occurs through the consequences of behavior. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and extinction play pivotal roles in shaping behavior. ***6. Examples. Classical conditioning. An example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's experiment where a bell, neutral stimulus, was paired with the presentation of food, unconditioned stimulus, eventually causing the bell alone to elicit a salivary response, conditioned response. Operant conditioning. An example of operant conditioning is training a dog. When the dog sits, behavior, and a treat is given, positive reinforcement, the likelihood of the dog sitting again increases. 7. Applications. Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is often utilized in therapeutic settings, such as exposure therapy for phobias. It is also relevant in marketing and advertising where pairing a product with positive emotions can influence consumer preferences. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is applied in various settings, including education, parenting, and workplace training. It forms the basis for shaping behaviors through reinforcement and punishment. 8. Temporal sequence. Classical conditioning. The association between stimuli is established through temporal contiguity, where the neutral stimulus precedes the unconditioned stimulus in close succession. Operant conditioning. The temporal sequence in operant conditioning involves the consequences following the behavior. Reinforcement or punishment occurs after the behavior, influencing its future occurrence. Conclusion. Classical and operant conditioning represent two pillars of learning theory in psychology, offering distinct insights into the mechanisms that govern how behaviors are acquired and modified. While classical conditioning centers on the association between stimuli and automatic responses, operant conditioning delves into the consequences that shape voluntary behaviors. The comprehension of both theories enriches our understanding of the complexities inherent in the learning process and provides valuable tools for behavior modification and therapy.